Stories don't happen by accident, so in this unit we're going to talk all about the different elements that make stories both successful and unsuccessful. First, we're going to dive into the plot of stories, so make sure you've got your notebook all set up and you're ready to follow along. In every single story, the plot carries the entire story. So a plot is a series of related events that tells what happens in a story. So in a story, one event causes another to occur, which causes another to occur, and so forth. Most plots are built from 5 elements. The first element is the exposition. So the exposition is the part of the story in which we are introduced to the characters, the setting, and the basic conflict. In some stories, the exposition occurs over several pages or chapters, and others, the exposition is super duper short. In addition, there's also the conflict. So the conflict is the main issue or problem in a story. There may be more than one conflict, though. Let's talk about characters. So there is usually a protagonist versus an antagonist. So the protagonist is the main character or the hero of the story. The story revolves around this person and they personally move the plot forward. The antagonist is the opposing force acting against the main character and are usually the villain of the story. So our protagonist is fighting for whatever they want, and the antagonist is opposing them, trying to fight back. The main characters are just who the story is about. They're the ones that move this scene forward, and then our minor characters are the other people in the story. They may influence the plot, but not nearly as much. Then there's the setting. So the setting is the time and the place of the story. This is the when and the where. The setting influences the culture and the society described in the story. So a story set in 2020 will look wildly different from a story set in the 1920s. A story set in 2020 New York will look different than 2020 Kansas. The setting helps us understand the meaning behind certain actions a character makes. This is where history comes in, because the historical context of the setting will influence the story. After characters and settings, there's the conflict. So there's usually either an internal or an external conflict. Internal is man versus themselves. They're fighting against themselves. They must overcome fear, anger, or past trauma. They are fighting against their own mind. Think hero overcomes their fear. External is man versus man. 2 people or groups against each other. Other people are preventing the protagonist from moving forward, so think hero versus villain. Lastly, there's man versus nature. The protagonist is struggling against the environment or outside forces. Here's a tree. Look at that tree. Think hero survives an earthquake, for example. So let's talk about an example with Finding Nemo. So an example of the exposition from Finding Nemo is when the viewer meets Marlin, Nemo, and the coral. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the exposition of Finding Nemo, though. So our main characters are arguably Nemo, Dory, and Merlin. The protagonists are going to be Merlin and Nemo, mostly Merlin. The antagonist is the ocean and that evil little girl, Darla. The setting is the ocean and present day. They also end up in Australia at one point. The conflict is mainly external, so man versus man and man versus nature, because both the ocean and other outside forces keep separating father from son. And then man versus themselves, because both Nemo and Merlin must overcome their fears to be reunited. After exposition, we've got our rising action. So we start the story, now we start rising. So the rising action is the part of the story in which the main character faces a series of conflicts on their journey towards reaching their goal. So conflict, conflict, conflict. This is the part of the story where suspense and interest starts to build. The rising actions in Finding Nemo are, after the divers take Nemo, Merlin experiences a series of conflicts as he tries to find Nemo. There's the jellyfish, the sharks in minefields, the turtles. All of these different things get in the way as he just tries to find his son. This gets us to the climax. The climax is known as the turning point of the story. The main character usually comes face to face with a conflict that changes them in some way. The climax is typically considered the most exciting moment of the story. This is the height of the action. This is when your heart is racing and you just want to know, will they or won't they solve their conflict or the problem? However, sometimes it's kind of hard to find the climax. So the climax, remember, is the height of the action. This is that turning point. This is the big fight scene, the moment of truth and the turning point. The climax is going to answer the story's biggest questions. Will they be reunited? Will they run away? Will they win the big fight or the big game? And then the climax starts to begin the resolution. The tension begins to release. The story starts to end. The climax in Finding Nemo. So this is when Nemo fakes his death to escape from the dentist's office. This acts as the climax because Marlin believes that his son is dead, which makes him depressed and upset. And as he's walking away, you're so tense because, oh my gosh, he's so close and he's starting to give up. We're tense, we're excited, we want to know what happens next. After the climax, we have the falling actions. So in the falling action, all loose ends of the plot are tied up, the conflicts and the climax are resolved. Sometimes there is no falling action, and this kind of makes stories unsatisfying at times because it means the climax happened really late in the story and it feels kind of rushed. Finding Nemo had an incredible falling action though, because this is where Marlin and Nemo are reunited after Nemo goes down the toilet. Lastly, we have our resolution. So this is where we're at. The resolution is the closing part of the story in which we learn how the characters have dealt with the outcome of the conflict. This is the conclusion of the story. This is when the characters have grown and they have become the new versions of themselves. The resolution of Finding Nemo is at the end of the story, we see Marlin taking Nemo to school after he's returned home. Additionally, Marlin is more relaxed and willing to take risks, while Nemo is popular with his school friends. So both characters throughout the course of the story have learned new things about themselves, and the resolution typically reflects that.